Hey everyone, welcome back. Hopefully everything's going well. You're able to follow along on Canvas and do the assignments. For Module 3, we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of areas. Number one, interview and interrogation, and then we'll kind of move into domestic violence and stalking. Victimology always encompasses everything. The whole idea that what do victims go through? There are many aspects to victimology. It's not always, just about the victim and how they came into contact with the suspect. Many different things involved, whether how the victim came onto that scene, how they knew the suspect. So there are many different characteristics. We teach a whole semester on victimology alone. But today we're going to get involved and talk a little bit about interview and interrogation. Very controversial, no doubt about it. I'm sure many of you have watched several movies based on detectives and law enforcement getting things wrong when they talk to somebody and putting the wrong person in jail. So again, it's like every other tool that we teach in law enforcement. Being good at interviewing and interrogating is extremely important. Number one, you can save the victim and the victim's family a lot of heartache by getting somebody to talk this through. Remember, I certainly believe that most suspects do want to do the right thing. They want to get this horrible thing that they did off their shoulders. I think that most suspects do want to confess, but they are extremely nervous. They are scared. If you're good at communication skills, you'll be able to get that person to trust you and to ultimately tell their side of the story. And it makes things much more easy. But remember, we don't want to put anybody into jail, make an arrest for anybody that didn't do that crime. So I get it. There are a lot of problems that we've identified in the past to make sure this doesn't happen. Certainly most detectives, most investigators throughout the country have been to schools where they've been taught these skills, like the Reed Interview and Interrogation School, places that have been around for 50, 60 years, helping us do the job that we do better. For those of you that are really into this and really want this as your career, I would highly recommend going on to YouTube and watching a YouTube on TED Talk that Mark Bowden, that's Bowden, did on body language. The majority of what we do in interview and interrogation is based on the skills that we have learned through body language experts like Mark Bowden. And Mark Bowden has spent his life in showing you these are the types of things that people do. So again, very, very important. There's also another YouTube called Gestures and Body Language. I highly recommend watching that. Give you a good idea of really what we're talking about. Before we get into this, I want you to understand that at no time do I want anybody to violate someone's constitutional rights. One of the biggest controversies surrounding interview and interrogation is the whole Miranda, the Miranda rights. Miranda rights were all about whether someone was in custody and if you were going to ask them questions. The Supreme Court looked at it as two triggers. Certainly if they're in custody and if you're going to ask them questions, it is their constitutional rights to have Miranda read to them prior to any of this happening. Don't ever forget that. So let's go back and talk a little bit about Mark Bowden and the idea that your communication skills and understanding body language are extremely important. Most of what we do in communicating as humans is listening. Humans speak at about 125 words a minute. That's pretty slow compared to what you're actually watching. As you're watching somebody and you're communicating with them, 65% of that communication is from nonverbal communication, things that the person's body is doing while they're talking. So, gathering meaning from the tone of voice, from that eye contact, facial expressions is extremely important. Mark Bowden, through his career, put this idea of communicating when people come into contact with one another and they immediately come face to face, that we put people into categories. The first category is you've never met the person, but when they come into contact with you, you view them based on the body language, based on the things that they are showing you subconsciously. First category is a friend. Are they a friend? Are they going to bring something good to you? Is it somebody that you trust? So this friend category, based on everything that you're bringing in, and whether, I'm not trying to get everyone out there to believe in the philosophy of evolution, but his work is based on millions of years of evolution. That this person is good to be around, they're safe to be around, so you put them in that friend category. The second category, when you come into contact with people, is predator. A lot of you out there have heard people say many times that they've got creepdar, that you've never met this person, that they give you bad vibes the minute you see them. It's because of millions of years of evolution. You're taking in this body language that they're presenting to you, and you're taking it in as, this is bad. I don't want to be around this person. If I don't get away from this person, flight or fight, this is going to hurt me. So you take them as a predator. So it's friend, predator. The third one is potential mate, that you come into contact with people because for whatever reason, you're attracted to one another, the body language that's being presented, potential sexual partner, this idea that you're going to mate with this person based on all the different things that you find attractive to that person. So again, friend, enemy or predator, a mate, sexual partner, or Mark Bowden would say that for the majority of people that you come into contact, especially in criminal justice when you're interviewing, is the fourth category. Fourth category is what he calls indifferent. Indifferent means you don't know. They're not giving you enough data to understand which one of the other three are they. If you don't know, we put you into the indifferent category because that protects you, and then it goes right back to predator, and then you run away from that person. So for the millions of people that you come into contact with, you don't give them enough data, they're going to put you into the category of predator because of indifference, just to protect themselves. And this is typically where you are at when you interview somebody. Remember, they've done something, they understand what they've done, they're scared, they meet you as a detective for the first time. They're going to either put you in predator category, not wanting to talk to you, or they're going to put you in that category of indifferent. So as a good communicator, in an interview and interrogation, you need to get this person comfortable. I know many of you out there are saying, well, I don't like what you're saying right now. Are we going to manipulate people? Yeah. If you don't manipulate people and at least that make them believe that you're a friend and that you're going to be good for them, and in many cases you are, you're going to help them through this process and you're going to help them find the best resolution to the dilemma that they're in today. If you can get them into that friend category, then they're more willing to talk to you and ultimately confess. So again, communication skills is extremely important. As we move into this interview and interrogation, in most agencies, most law enforcement agencies, we teach it as two separate categories. An interview is separate from an interrogation. In an interview, you're meeting people, you're meeting the suspects, you're meeting many people that might not be the suspects. In this interview, you're trying to establish rapport, get that person into that friend category. You're trying to ask them many questions. Remember, keep Miranda in mind. But in an interview, we're asking them all kinds of questions, open-ended questions. We want them to talk because when they're talking, we're understanding what is this person like when they're comfortable. When they're comfortable talking about things that they like, how is their body responding? That nonverbal communication is extremely important in this interview process. So, two things to remember. We're trying to build rapport. We're trying to observe their reactions. And ultimately, if you get good at this, it's no different than your parents. They know when you're lying based on your body language. People that you know, we call these tells in poker, meaning somebody's doing something and I know based on the way their body's reacting that they're being deceptive. They're hiding something. So in the interview process, we're trying to look at the body language when they're comfortable and when they're not comfortable, how are they reacting? So then we start to move into that second phase of what we call an interrogation. We'll understand where we set with this person. Absolutely. You'll spend weeks of training just in the interview process alone. We're looking for all kinds of signs of deceptions, the comfort level, the discomfort level, the emphasis, the synchrony. It's the idea of perception management. You need to be good at understanding why are they acting in the way that they are, their body language, the way they talk, based on everything that we're talking about. In this interview, we're going to set up the room. We're going to set up the room where we bring them in to talk to us, or if I go to them, I'm going to set the room up in a specific way so that I know that I can watch their body language in greater detail. For decades, psychologists have told us to do certain things, kind of removing barriers. We don't like to have anybody with things in their hands, in their lap, because this is what we call the truth plane. When people are uncomfortable, they cover this part up. They close their arms. They do things in this area of their body. So we don't want them to be holding anything. I don't want them to have anything behind me that they can concentrate on. So if I was talking to them, I wouldn't want that map behind me, because if people have things to concentrate on, they're not concentrating on me. So remember, we do set up a room in a specific way because we're trying to observe in great detail. We ask specific questions. We certainly want to ask specific questions because psychologists have told us over the years that people that are guilty will answer the question this way. People that are innocent will answer it in a different way. Again, like with all of the evidence that I've talked about in the past and those labs that I do for evidence, I do labs with this as well. So if this is something that you truly want to watch and see how this works, again, in the semesters following, whether it's the fall semester, spring semester, if you send me an email, I will let you know when this class is going to take place so you can watch this firsthand. As we move into the interrogation, completely different. We try to have a break in between. But in the interrogation, we certainly, at this point, change the demeanor from the investigator's point of view to that person we're asking questions. In the interview, they would respond, open-ended questions, a lot of responses. They talked a lot. In the interrogation, they no longer talk. It's my turn to talk. At this point, we usually make an accusation. We accuse them of what we feel confident that they've done, and we go into a completely different mode where I speak, they listen. If they want me to be there in that chair after I've Mirandized them to kind of help them through this process, then I will stay there in that chair. But we go about it in a much different way than we did in the interview. Remember, in most cases, suspects commit crimes because they believe it's the best solution, to their needs at that moment. If the investigator is able to convince the suspect that the key issue is not the crime itself, but what motivated them to commit the crime, they will begin to rationalize their motivating factors, and they'll talk to us. And if they talk to us and they admit to something that they've done, it'll get us to that court process, and alleviate a lot of pain from a lot of people. Extremely important. So interview and interrogation, I would say, is an extremely important skill that a good investigator needs in their tool belt to do this job, because it's something that can get us from A to Z much quicker. Let's talk about as far as how do we identify and arrest people on the street. For the most part, we don't see a lot of lineups anymore. The idea of bringing suspects in and lining them up in order, we just don't do a lot because we have made a lot of mistakes. One of the big mistakes we've made in the past, putting the wrong person in jail, is we understand now that victims under that stress, they are not good at identifying the person that did that to them. Witness identification and victim identification, they are horrible at. And we have to understand that. So the lineup idea, bringing people in front of a victim and having them say, yes, that person did this crime to them, has a lot of problems with it. So we've changed the whole format. In fact, we don't do lineups like we see in TV anymore. We do it in an array, one at a time. We don't have them stand together. So again, it's a lengthy process that we do one at a time, picking people to be a participant in that array that are very similar in the way they look, trying to eliminate a lot of the mistakes we've made in the past. So yes, we do show-ups or arrays, photo arrays, but nothing like you see on TV, the lineup idea in the past. Another way that we develop suspects is certainly through confidential informants. And it's not always somebody that you consider a snitch working to get charges off. It could be just people in the community, people that you've built relationships with, people that you talk to on a daily basis as a detective, as a police officer, and just being engaged with those people. Many times they can give you information that you previously didn't have. So really identifying people in crimes is a multitude of ways that we do that. Certainly surveillance is another one. Many times we'll set up on a stationary surveillance with information that was given to us, watching a location. Many times we'll do a moving surveillance. We've been given information about a vehicle, we'll follow a vehicle. So we do a lot of things in trying to observe and surveil. Hopefully in the end we get enough probable cause. Remember, probable cause are facts and circumstances. They're facts and circumstances that would warrant a prudent person in believing that a crime has been committed and the accused committed it. So if we get that probable cause during a surveillance, then hopefully we can write it up in an affidavit, an essay, present that in front of a magistrate. If they sign it, it will be an exception to the Fourth Amendment, and we then can have a warrant to then go in and execute that warrant for a potential suspect or crime scene evidence. Again, many aspects to that. As far as the arrest, I always put it into three categories. Law enforcement have this power to arrest somebody, to take them out of society, remove them, and incarcerate them. We call it three different times that a government agent or law enforcement come into contact. The first time, we've talked about, it's just when you have that consensual encounter. At that point, police have no power. The second one was reasonable suspicion. We have a gut instinct telling us, based on lots of emotions, that we believe something doesn't look right, that just doesn't look right. We have an opportunity, based on what the Supreme Court said, that we could detain them for a brief detention. During that brief detention, if we do get facts and circumstances, probable cause, then we can make an arrest. Arrests in the United States, typically misdemeanors, the crime has to occur in front of the law enforcement agent. Law enforcement have to observe a misdemeanor in order to arrest. There are exceptions. One of those exceptions is battery, domestic violence. We will talk about that. Otherwise, the majority of misdemeanors, the law enforcement agent has to have it happen in front of them. For felonies, that's not the case. Law enforcement can arrest for a felony that did not occur in their presence if they have probable cause. So keep that in mind when we talk about all these different things with regards to arrests, because especially with domestic violence, which again, like everything in this field of study, is controversial. We all watched as Gabby Petito, while in Utah, went through this domestic violence interaction in Utah, which ultimately led to her death and the potential death of the suspect that we were looking into at that time. So it depends on the jurisdiction and how arrests are made based on domestic violence. But in most states, domestic violence is a misdemeanor. It occurs as a result of many factors. It's not just about battery. It could be property crimes involved. It could be arson. Many things can incorporate into domestic violence. But when we make an arrest for a misdemeanor battery domestic violence, because that is an exception, we look at it in three different ways. Number one, we have to determine a relationship. If they're strangers that commit a misdemeanor battery, they don't meet that criteria. It needs to have a relationship attached to it. Did the relationship exist between the person who committed the battery and the victim? Are they a family member? Are they married? There are a lot of different definitions that meet the criteria of that relationship. We then have to show that a battery did occur. It's very confusing in law. We hear the terms assault and we hear the terms battery. They are not the same. Assault means I wanted to hurt you, I tried to hurt you, but I was unsuccessful. I attempted, I was unsuccessful. Battery, you were successful. You did create a battery. Battery, by definition, is the unlawful use of force or violence upon the person of another. So, you have a relationship, you commit a battery, and in most departments, we have a time limit within 24 hours that this battery occurred. An arrest will be made. Whether that arrest is mandatory depends on the state. Every state has the ability to define in criminal statutes whether it should be at the discretion of the officer or whether it's mandatory and the officer will make an arrest based on those parameters that we just talked about. Remember, battery domestic violence is a big problem. It's a huge problem. So as we discuss this, remember it's the number one call that law enforcement will go on that we lose our life. It's very, very dangerous. And it occurs in alarming numbers in the United States. We teach classes at SUU about domestic violence and about victimology. Understand at this point that everyone is capable. Everyone. It doesn't mean that you're weak if you are a victim of domestic violence. Very strong people have been victims of domestic violence. Can we profile it to some degree? Certainly. Some of the things that we have learned over the years is that people that are going to commit domestic violence on someone they love, typically they move in three different categories. They initially want to seduce and charm somebody. They want to be portrayed as somebody that is so good over the top, best person on the planet. And then they tend to isolate the victim, get them away from their friends, their family, that support group. And then the suspect at this point will then introduce the threat of violence and ultimately ending in a battery. So there are profilings to these types of crimes, but remember the idea that assault and battery, different categories. Based on your jurisdiction and how you're going to investigate this crime, remember the elements of a crime. Elements of the crime are completely different, when we talk about elements of a crime and categories of a crime or classifications of crime. Classifications of crime are how serious your state puts the crime in a category. We categorize classifications as the minor being misdemeanor and the serious being felonies. These are classifications of crime. Elements of a crime or what law enforcement need, what detectives, investigators need in a case to make an arrest. We have to show that the suspect committed every one of these elements of the crime. In this case, domestic violence. Did the suspect have a relationship? Element number one. Did the suspect commit a battery? Element number two. And did the suspect commit this battery within a time period, 24 hours? If all three of those elements exist, then law enforcement can make the rare exception of an arresting the person for domestic violence, even though it did not occur in their presence. So again, remember, whether it's robbery, murder, all of these have specific elements of a crime that as a detective, you have to look at each one of them. Did they commit that? Yes. Did they commit that? If any of the elements are missing, you cannot arrest the person for that crime. They have to have committed all of the elements. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't do another crime, but you need to arrest for the appropriate crime that has all of the elements attached to it. When we talk about stalking, a little bit different. Certainly domestic violence is the number one call for service for all law enforcement. In fact, let's keep a couple of stats in mind when we talk about domestic violence. Women are twice as likely, in many states, 3 times more likely to use a blunt object. Obviously, if they're the suspect, they're trying to even the playing field. 85% of all the abusers, 85% are men. So yes, women commit domestic violence, but 85% are men. In fact, 1 in 3 women in the United States are going to be victims of some sort of domestic violence in their lifetime. What's even more startling is that 70% of victims of domestic violence, when they finally do separate from that offender, 70% of them could be victims a later date on that separation of murder. It's a very dangerous time, that separation from the abuser. And we know this in law enforcement, so keep this into perspective when we're talking about domestic violence. Another thing that we need to understand is the Lautenberg Act. Lautenberg. This Lautenberg Act of 1996, federal law said that if you're convicted of a battery domestic violence, you no longer have the right, according to the Second Amendment, to own and possess a firearm. This has just been upheld by the Supreme Court currently. So the Lautenberg Act of 1996 says if you are convicted of a domestic violence, you are no longer allowed in the United States to possess a firearm. So keep that in mind. It's the law. So when we talk about predictors of domestic violence, what would cause somebody to commit this crime? Again, profilers within the FBI criminal profiling unit have over the last 3 or 4 decades realized that one of the key things that causes somebody to hurt someone they love is history of family violence. Did they have a history of family violence? Animal cruelty, again, strong predictor of someone that might abuse someone they love. Unemployment seems to be a trigger at the moment that this occurs. So remember, unemployment, history of family violence, these are all predictors. It doesn't mean everyone that has these is going to be someone that abuses someone, but they are predictors, things that could cause somebody to do this crime. Let's talk a little bit about stalking. Your book and your chapter talks a little bit about it. Like everything else that I've talked about in class, every state will define it a little bit different. In most states, stalking is a felony. It's worse than like a misdemeanor battery in that we understand the potential for the victim being hurt, potentially losing their life as a result of somebody that is going to do these things of stalking. Typically, stalking is somebody that, although independently the things they are doing are not against the law, that we have learned over time that someone that does these characteristics tend to stalk. They ultimately end up hurting the victim. These things like following somebody to work, following somebody to school every day after a breakup. They do certain things like call them on the phone 10 times, 20, 100, 1,000. They do all of this over, not realizing that this relationship is over. They continue to try and have contact. They follow people. And remember, think about it. Texting somebody without threatening them typically is not against the law. But if someone breaks up with you and you text them 20, 30, 40 times a day, and on top of that, you're following them, these are characteristics that we can look at elements of a crime for a potential charge of stalking. On top of what the offender is doing, we also look at what did the victim have to do. So before we charge with stalking, we typically look at the victim and look at details like what has changed in your life? What have you done because you're afraid, you're scared of this person potentially hurting you severely, potentially taking your life? Have you put up gates around your house? Fencing? Have you put bars up? Have you changed the locks? Have you got many dogs in there, pit bulls? I mean, what are you doing that your life has drastically changed? Are you driving to work or school a different way every day because you're afraid someone's following you? So again, we look at what the victim has to do. We look at what the offender's doing to potentially decide, do we believe this person is going to cause serious bodily injury to the victim? Potentially might even be a murder. Then we make an arrest for stalking. Within this category, we also look at elder abuse. Elder abuse falls into many, many categories as well. The whole idea that someone can intentionally do neglectful acts towards someone that's old falls into many, many categories. It's not just physical. It can be emotional trauma. It can be psychological trauma. So there's many categories that when people abuse the elderly, when we make an arrest based on elder abuse, we look at many different categories to determine, what is going on there. When we go back and we look at all these different categories, whether it's stalking, domestic violence, we lean heavily on the FBI's criminal profiling unit and the profiles that they do on not only the victims who potentially could become a victim and who potentially could be a suspect. For instance, one of the key things that we look at when we look at people that are abused, the children in a home, who do they typically, or what is the profile of that child that typically is abused in a domestic violence home? Typically, it is a single parent that has a live-in roommate, someone that's living with them, that they're attached to. So single parent that has a live-in partner. Typically, if there's children involved, that child could be at high risk. It doesn't mean every single parent that has a live-in partner, that live-in partner is going to hurt this child. But that is a strong characteristic when we look at certain things to decide whether or not this could be dangerous. So the profiling unit gives us a lot of different things that helps us out during our career. Remember, one of the big problems with trying to identify a suspect is victim ID. So remember all of these different things when we make a conversation about how do we put a case together on domestic violence, using the victimology, elder abuse. These all come into play. Hopefully that helped out. Many of these things we do in greater detail in my classes. So again, touch bases with me with an email if it's something that you would like to pursue, and I'll invite you to my class as we explore this idea further. Again, we'll see you next time.